A poor man saves a young lady from drowning, unaware she's a billionaire, and changes his life. The river was a ribbon of silver beneath the morning mist, its slow-moving waters reflecting the sky's pale hush. Dawn had only just begun to stretch its light over the sleepy village, where crooked rooftops peeked through the trees like children waking from dreams. The world felt untouched here, pure, simple, steady. And there, near the river's bend, was Thomas. Before we go further, please ensure to like, share, and subscribe for more interesting stories like this one. He stood ankle-deep in the chill shallows, his hands wrapped tightly around the frayed rope of a handmade fishing net. Every knot in it told a story of struggle, of survival, of quiet determination that never made the news. The boat beside him, old and weather-bitten, was barely afloat, yet loyal in its wear. Just like him, his movements were unhurried, shaped by years of repetition. He dragged the net from the water, examined it with the eyes of a craftsman, then gently shook free a few modest fish. No complaints crossed his lips. For Thomas, each morning was not a pursuit of wealth but of rhythm, a conversation with the river he had long ago made peace with. Up the bank, a pair of barefoot children passed by, chasing one another with wooden sticks. When they spotted him, they halted. "Morning, Uncle Tom," one shouted, grinning through missing teeth. Thomas glanced up and smiled, a warm, crooked grin that hinted at 1,000 untold stories. "And what mischief are you two up to this early?" "Gonna catch frogs," the other boy announced proudly, holding up a rusty tin can. Thomas chuckled, tossing them a small fish. "Trade you this for one frog." "A big one." The boys laughed, made a deal with dramatic flair, and skipped away toward the marshes. Their laughter faded into the trees, leaving behind the hush of morning once again. Thomas stood still, listening. The breeze was soft. Leaves rustled like whispers. Somewhere overhead, a kingfisher darted across the water, its wings slicing through mist. He watched it go, admiring its grace, and for a long moment, there was peace. Then, it came faint, distant, and sharp. A scream. At first, it was just a sliver of sound, almost lost among the river's hush. Thomas paused, turning his head toward it. His brow furrowed. It had no shape, no direction, just fear, torn open and flung into the quiet. Then it came again. Louder. He dropped the net. No hesitation. His boots sank into the wet mud as he pushed through the reeds, heart already climbing in his chest. He scanned the shoreline, eyes narrowing. Nothing yet, just fog, water, and trees. But the scream had changed things. The river no longer felt gentle. The birds had gone silent. Even the sun, still low in the sky, seemed to hesitate. Thomas broke into a run. His breath came steady, not because he wasn't afraid, but because he'd trained himself long ago to stay calm when it mattered. And this mattered. Someone was in trouble. Somewhere ahead. Somewhere close. He leapt over driftwood, slid across damp rocks. The path curved, dipped, twisted like the river itself, and still he ran. Another scream. This time it was clear female. Raw panic laced every syllable. Thomas pushed harder, lungs burning, the world narrowing to sound and instinct. Trees gave way to a wider clearing ahead, and the fog shifted, almost pulling back like a curtain before a stage. His boots skidded to a stop. He scanned the horizon. His breath billowed in the air. But the river, once a friend, offered no clues. And yet, something was wrong. He could feel it. The moment hung there, suspended. And just like that, the scene froze, his figure framed by trees, face locked in a mixture of alarm and resolve, the scream still echoing in his mind. What waited ahead, he didn't yet know. But he would find it. The cry sliced through the mist like a blade. Thomas sprinted toward the sound, feet pounding over the uneven, muddy ground. The river's peaceful rhythm was gone, replaced by urgency roaring in his ears. Brambles clawed at his trousers, but he didn't slow down. Instinct drove him. Someone needed help. Pushing through a wall of tall grass, he caught a glimpse of movement, a frantic splash against the gray water. His heart slammed against his ribs. There, caught in the river's cruel current, was a young woman. She fought wildly, arms flailing, her head barely breaking the surface. Her dress, elegant but soaked and heavy, dragged her down like an anchor. Thomas didn't hesitate. In a single motion, he tore off his jacket and flung it aside, boots kicking up mud as he lunged forward. The river was colder than he expected, a shock that tightened his muscles, but he forced his way through the freezing pull. His eyes locked onto her as he swam, every stroke a battle against the water's stubborn grip. She sank once. His pulse surged. Kicking harder, he dove under. The world became murky, shadows and swirling silt blurring his vision. He reached out, groping through the gloom, and caught the silk of her dress. Gripping it tightly, he hauled upward with every ounce of strength he had. They burst from beneath the surface. The woman's face was pale, her eyes closed. Her body was limp against him, dead weight in the relentless current. Gritting his teeth, Thomas hooked an arm around her chest and fought his way back toward the shore. Each kick, each pull of his free arm, was a test of endurance. The river did not let go easily. At last, his feet scraped the rocky bottom. Staggering through the shallows, he dragged her onto the muddy bank, collapsing beside her. Water streamed from their clothes, pooling around them. She wasn't breathing. No time for fear. Thomas rolled her onto her back, checked her airway with trembling fingers, then began chest compressions. His palms pressed down in firm, desperate rhythm. Between sets, he tilted her head back and breathed into her mouth, willing life back into her still form. "Come on," he muttered, voice ragged. Seconds stretched into agonizing eternities. Suddenly, she coughed. A violent, gasping wretch's river water spewed from her lips. Her body jolted under his hands. She turned to her side, hacking and wheezing, every breath a harsh battle for air. Relief crashed through him like a wave. He helped steady her, murmuring words he wasn't even sure she could hear. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment. Her gaze, glassy, wide with fear and confusion, is filled with fierce concern. No names were exchanged, no questions asked. In that silent exchange, there was only the raw, trembling truth of survival. She tried to speak but failed, her voice lost to exhaustion. Thomas gently touched her shoulder. "You're all right now," he said, though he wasn't sure she even understood. She clutched weakly at the earth beneath her, grounding herself. Around them, the mist closed in again, muting the world. He shrugged out of his soaked shirt and covered her shaking body. It wasn't much, but it was warm against the river's bite. Her designer dress, once beautiful, clung in tatters, its delicate fabric torn by the brutal current. She looked so fragile, so out of place against the muddy bank. A low wail of sirens cut through the air. Thomas turned his head toward the sound. Emergency lights flickered faintly through the trees, weaving their way toward the riverbank. Help was coming. He stayed kneeling beside her, hands steady despite the cold, eyes never leaving her fragile figure. She was conscious, but barely. Her breathing, though ragged, grew steadier with each moment. Thomas didn't ask who she was, didn't wonder why a woman in such fine clothes had ended up drowning in a river that only locals knew how to respect. None of it mattered now. What mattered was that she was alive. He adjusted the shirt covering her shoulders, shielding her from the chill, and kept his body between her and the river as if daring the current to try again. The sirens grew louder, tires crunching over gravel somewhere beyond the trees. Thomas tightened his grip on her hand, reassurance, solidarity, a wordless promise that she wasn't alone. The young woman's eyelids fluttered weakly, a breath of gratitude passing her lips, too faint to hear. He squeezed her hand gently. And there they stayed, two lives tethered by an unexpected moment, as flashing lights broke through the mist. The flashing lights painted the mist red and blue, a surreal, shifting haze that blurred the trees and made the world feel unsteady. Thomas rose slowly as a team of paramedics sprinted toward him, their voices crisp, professional, cutting through the damp air. He stepped back without needing to be told, hands dropping to his sides. His soaked clothes clung heavily to his frame, the river still dripping from him in steady rivulets. No one asked if he was hurt. All attention funneled straight to the young woman lying motionless beneath his worn shirt. A paramedic knelt, checking her vitals with clinical speed. Another prepared an oxygen mask. They worked without panic, but with the urgency of people who knew every second counted. Thomas hovered a few steps away, heart thudding, not with fear anymore, but with a strange sense of detachment. He wanted to stay, to make sure she was all right, but a wall had risen between them, invisible and firm. An ambulance door swung open with a metallic groan, spilling more light onto the muddy bank. Thomas expected them to carry her toward it. He expected the usual. Stretcher, sirens, a rushed ride to the nearest hospital. But that wasn't what happened. Out of the mist emerged a sleek, black car, silent, polished, utterly out of place against the dirt road and battered emergency vehicles. It slid to a halt near the riverbank, engine purring like a resting beast. Thomas frowned. Two men stepped out, dressed not in uniforms but dark suits, their movements smooth and deliberate. They spoke briefly with the lead paramedic, their faces serious, unreadable. After a few clipped words were exchanged, they turned toward Thomas. One of them, A tall man with a shaved head and sharp features approached him. "You did well," he said curtly, voice low and practiced. "We have it from here." Thomas opened his mouth to speak, to ask who she was, but the words tangled and died before they formed. Something in the man's tone, something in his expression, warned him against pressing too hard. Instead, Thomas nodded once, feeling like a child who had stumbled into a world he wasn't meant to see. The young woman, still dazed, was helped gently to her feet. She clung weakly to the arms that supported her, her eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. For a fleeting second, her gaze lifted toward Thomas. Recognition flared there, small, uncertain, but real. She tried to say something, her lips parting, but one of the suited men leaned in, murmuring in her ear. Whatever words she might have offered withered in her throat. Without another glance, they led her to the waiting car. The door shut behind her with a soft, final click. The engine growled, the tires crushed gravel underfoot, and just like that, the car disappeared back into the mist, swallowed by the trees as if it had never been there at all. Thomas stood alone at the river's edge, the echo of the moment lingering like a ghost. The paramedics gathered their equipment, muttering to each other in low voices. A police officer scribbled notes by the roadside, casting Thomas a brief, indifferent glance. No one asked for his statement. No one offered an explanation. He was left there, wet, cold, the river whispering beside him. Thomas glanced down at the muddy imprint where she had lain only minutes ago. His jacket still rested there, sodden and forgotten, as if it too had been abandoned. He stooped, picked it up, and slung it over one shoulder. The fabric was heavy with river water, but he barely felt it. His mind churned with questions he couldn't shape into words. Who was she? Why the black car? Why the suits? And why, after pulling someone back from death itself, did he feel more invisible now than ever before? The sky above had shifted while he wasn't looking. The mist was thinning, the pale sun beginning to pry apart the heavy clouds. Around him, the village was stirring. The distant clatter of morning routines, the lowing of cattle, the first shouts of merchants setting up their stalls. Life resumed, indifferent to the secrets the river had tried to conceal. Thomas took a slow, steadying breath. He would return to his boat, his nets, his quiet life. The river would continue to flow, and the world would turn, and perhaps, he would forget the strangeness of this morning. Or perhaps not. Because deep in his gut, where instinct lived and never lied, Thomas knew this was not the end of it. It was only the beginning. The river looked the same, but Thomas did not. Days had passed since the rescue, yet the image of the young woman still hovered in his mind, soaked, fragile, half-conscious in his arms. He tried to brush it off as a strange, passing chapter. Life on the river didn't wait for reflections. Nets needed mending. Boats needed care. Fish didn't catch themselves. But even as his hands repeated the motions they'd learned over decades, something inside him had shifted. He found himself staring at the river longer than usual, listening more closely, as if expecting something, though he couldn't say what. The morning was quiet. The fog, thinner than the day of the rescue, hung lazily over the water as sunlight filtered through the trees. Thomas sat at the edge of his boat, barefoot, mending a torn net. The familiar sounds of the village were behind him, faint, distant. Then came the low hum of an engine. Not the coughing rattle of a local's pickup, but something smoother, deeper. He turned. A black SUV crept along the dirt path near the water's edge, its body gleaming against the dull mud. Too clean for this part of the world. The door opened. A woman stepped out, tall, polished, clipboard in hand. She didn't belong here either. She walked with calm, deliberate steps until she reached him. "Mr. Thomas?" He stood, suspicious but polite. "That's me." Without a word, she extended a white envelope. No logos. No markings. Thomas wiped his hands on his shirt before accepting it. The SUV idled behind her, silent and powerful. The envelope was thick. Inside, a single folded letter and a small rectangular slip of paper. He read the letter first. "Dear Thomas, you saved my life. There are no words for that, but I believe actions speak louder. Please accept this, not as payment, but as a door. You didn't ask for anything, but you deserve everything. Eleanor." He frowned. Eleanor. The name felt unfamiliar and familiar all at once. The handwriting was elegant, slanted with confidence. Then he looked at the slip of paper. It was a bank check. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. He read the amount twice. A third time. The ink didn't change. It was enough to replace his boat, buy land, or retire. It was more than he'd seen in his entire life. He looked up sharply. "What is this?" The assistant remained composed. "Miss Eleanor Delacroix asked that this be delivered personally. She's asked if you'd consider coming to meet her in the city. She would like to thank you herself." Delacroix. Even someone like Thomas had heard that name. Hotels. Media. A family fortune old enough to shape countries. He looked back down at the letter. The paper still trembled slightly in his hand. "I'm just a fisherman," he said softly, more to himself than anyone else. The woman smiled faintly. "You're the man who saved her." And that, apparently, was more than enough. Thomas stared out at the river again. It flowed on, steady as ever, but everything around it had changed. The afternoon light leaned low across the river, casting golden streaks on its rippling surface. Cicadas hummed in the warm stillness, and the air smelled faintly of wet earth and drying reeds. Thomas sat on the edge of his boat, hands idle, gaze lost in the flow of the water. Though the days had passed since the black SUV appeared, his mind hadn't wandered far from the name etched in his thoughts, Eleanor. He didn't expect her to return. People like her didn't circle back. They flew in, dropped shadows, and vanished behind tinted windows. So when he heard soft footsteps on gravel, he didn't turn at once. It could have been anyone. A villager. A child. But the moment stretched strangely. Silent. Present. He looked up. There she was. She wore no makeup, no jewels, no layers of wealth to shield her. Just a pale blouse, jeans, and eyes that remembered the river. "Hello," she said softly. Thomas rose, uncertain. "Elena," she offered, before he could speak. Not Eleanor. Just Elena. A small smile tugged at his lips. "Thomas," he replied, though she already knew. They stood in the light together, quiet as the river between them. "I didn't get to thank you," she said finally. "Properly." "You already did," he answered. "You're alive." She stepped closer, gaze never leaving his. "Still, I owe you more than a letter and a check." Thomas shook his head gently. "You don't owe me anything." But she reached into her bag, pulling out a thin envelope. "Just take it," she said. "No strings. Call it a gift." He glanced at it. Didn't move. "I've never been one for handouts," he said. "It's not charity." "Then what is it?" She hesitated, then placed the envelope on the bench beside him. "I don't know yet," she said honestly, "but I'd like to know you." He studied her. She wasn't faking it. No cameras. No audience. Just a woman who'd nearly died, and a man who pulled her from the river. "What do you want to know?" he asked. "Everything." He blinked. "That might take a while." "I'm not in a hurry." So they walked. The river, always beside them, murmured as they moved along its worn path. Thomas talked. Not the way people talk when they try to impress. He didn't edit or decorate. He told her about the boat he'd built with his father when he was 17, how the floods took their home, how his wife, a teacher, had died during childbirth, how the child didn't make it either, and how, ever since, he stayed near the water because it was the one thing that never left him. He spoke of seasons, fish, hunger, and the quiet ache of getting older with more memories than hopes. And Elena listened, not with polite nods or distant smiles, but truly listened. She didn't interrupt. Her steps matched his. She asked nothing that required more than he wanted to give. When they circled back to the village, the sun had nearly dipped behind the hills. "Would you mind if I saw where you live?" she asked. He hesitated for the first time. Not out of embarrassment. Just surprise. "It's nothing special. I'd still like to see it." So he led her through the narrow footpaths, past stray goats and barefoot children, to a small weather-worn house with cracked walls and a corrugated iron roof. The garden was wild, but alive. Tomatoes, peppers, and herbs wrestled their way out of the soil. Inside, the space was clean but bare. A wooden table, 2 chairs, a shelf of worn books, a single bed tucked into the corner. The air smelled of dried tobacco, river mud, and the faint comfort of old wood. Elena stepped in without hesitation. She looked around, not with pity, but with quiet reflection. Her gaze lingered on a faded photo pinned to the wall. Thomas and a woman with gentle eyes, both younger, standing beside the river. "Your wife?" she asked. He nodded. "Anna. She was beautiful. She was kind." Elena said nothing more. Her silence was not awkward. It was reverent. She turned slowly, her eyes taking in the chipped floor, the patched ceiling, the handmade tools hanging beside the door. This man, who had asked for nothing, lived with less than she'd ever known. Yet she felt no lack here. Only resilience. A quiet dignity that did not ask to be seen. As he busied himself lighting a small lantern, Elena stepped outside for air. The sky had deepened into a soft twilight, stars just beginning to flicker. She looked out over the village, her mind turning. There was something here. Something most people never touched, not in boardrooms or penthouses. It wasn't success. It wasn't luck. It was something stronger. She looked back at the small home, and at the man who lived within it. Not pity, she told herself. Promise. She made no declarations, no decisions, but a quiet resolve took root, one she would carry with her when she left. Inside, Thomas returned with 2 enamel cups and a pot of tea that smelled of lemongrass. Sit, he said, pulling out the second chair. And she did. The city loomed like a different planet, glass towers gleaming under the midday sun, cars moving in endless streams, the air itself buzzing with invisible energy. Thomas stood stiffly at the edge of the hotel lobby, his rough boots silent against marble floors polished to a mirror's sheen. He clutched the strap of his worn bag tighter, feeling more like a misplaced relic than a guest. Elena appeared by his side, dressed simply yet with an effortless elegance. She smiled reassuringly, sensing his discomfort. "You're with me," she said warmly, as if those 3 words could bridge the enormous gap between their worlds. A bellhop in a neat uniform guided them to the elevators. The ride to the penthouse suite was smooth and silent, yet Thomas's heart pounded louder than any machine. When the doors opened, he stepped into a space larger than his entire home. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a view that stretched to the edge of the horizon, furniture soft enough to swallow a man whole. New clothes awaited him, shirts softer than anything he had ever owned, shoes that gleamed without a single scuff. Dinner that night was a parade of flavors he couldn't name, served by staff who treated him not with pity, but with quiet respect. At every turn, Elena stayed close, introducing him simply. "This is Thomas, a friend." One evening, as the city lights flickered like stars below, she invited him to sit with her on the balcony. The air smelled faintly of jasmine and asphalt. "I have an idea," she began, her voice gentle. "My company's launching a sustainable fishing initiative. We need someone who knows the water, someone who respects it." Thomas looked down at his hands, scarred and calloused. "I'm no businessman," he said. She smiled. "I'm not asking for a suit and tie. I'm asking for heart, integrity, things you've lived your whole life without needing a title." He stared at the glittering skyline, feeling its weight and wonder. Doubts swirled in his chest. Was there truly a place for someone like him in a world like this? But when he turned to Elena, he found no judgment, only belief. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to imagine a different kind of life. Months had passed since Thomas first stepped into the city, since his world had shifted from the simplicity of the riverbank to the complexities of corporate meetings and luxury. In the time that followed, he had adjusted, slowly, but surely, finding a rhythm between the familiar hum of his past and the unfamiliar pulse of his new life. Now, Thomas stood on a modern fishing dock, his gaze fixed on the water, the steady clatter of the crew filling the air around him. The dock was different from the one he had once known. The steel and concrete felt solid beneath his boots, but the sea of faces working alongside him was still a mixture of youth and determination, just like the children who once ran past his boat. Only now, they listened when he spoke, following his instructions with a quiet respect. His hands, though no longer rough from years of pulling nets and hauling fish, still held the weight of experience. He was no longer a lone fisherman, but a leader, one who understood the waters and the people who depended on them. The sustainable fishing initiative Elena had introduced him to was flourishing. The community had embraced it, just as Thomas had. He wasn't just teaching them about the river, he was teaching them about respect, how to nurture the water as it had nurtured them. His new home, while modest, was a reflection of this balance. Situated just outside the city, it was a small but beautiful space, wooden floors, soft lighting, and a garden that he tended himself. A far cry from the small, weather-worn house he once called home, but it carried the same simplicity, the same grounded warmth. Elena had visited often, but their conversations had changed over time. Their bond had evolved from gratitude to friendship, and from friendship to something more profound, a mutual understanding that transcended background, wealth, and circumstance. She never spoke of the past, of the day he saved her life, but it was always there, lingering in the spaces between their words. They were equals now, their lives intertwined in ways they hadn't expected. Elena, with her elegance and poise, never made Thomas feel as if he owed her anything. In fact, it was she who often seemed in awe of him, of his kindness, his quiet wisdom, and the way he had rebuilt his life with a humility she had come to respect deeply. She never forgot the man who had thrown himself into the river without hesitation, never asking for anything in return. That afternoon, as Thomas surveyed the bustling dock, a familiar figure appeared at the far end. Elena walked toward him, her presence as steady as the tide. She wasn't dressed in the luxurious clothes he remembered, but in something simple, a sundress, her hair loosely tied back. She smiled when she saw him, and for a moment, the noise of the world seemed to fade away. "Everything running smoothly?" she asked. Thomas nodded. "Better than ever." She walked up beside him, her gaze following his to the workers moving in unison on the dock. "You've done something good here, Thomas," she said, her voice soft but sincere. This is your doing." He shrugged, a small smile tugging at his lips. "It's all of us. We're a team." Elena was quiet for a moment, looking out at the water with him. Then, with a glance back at him, she spoke again. "You deserve this," she said, her voice firm with conviction. "All of it." Thomas didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned his eyes back to the water. It was the same river, but now it was different. It felt full, like a vessel of both past and present, of struggles and victories. He wasn't standing there anymore as the man who had nothing but the water and the hope of a good catch. He was standing there as someone who had been seen, someone whose quiet generosity had been returned in ways he never thought possible. The wind picked up slightly, tugging at the edges of his shirt. The sun was beginning to dip low, casting a golden hue over the water. Thomas stood tall, his hands relaxed at his sides, a smile breaking across his face not because of the things he now had, but because he finally understood what it meant to truly belong. For the first time in his life, he was no longer invisible. His kindness, his sacrifices, everything had led him to this moment. And as Elena stood beside him, watching the sun sink behind the horizon, Thomas knew this was just the beginning. The river had always been a part of him, and now it was more than just a source of survival. It was a symbol of everything he had gained, not through riches or accolades, but through his heart. The story wasn't over. Not yet. But as Thomas smiled and looked out at the water, he knew he had already found everything he needed. If you enjoyed this story, ensure to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing, heartfelt stories like this. Also, let us know where you are watching from, and drop your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear from you.